Hey everybody, today we are going to paint a landscape with watercolors. I'm using my White Nights watercolors here that have been in use for quite some time, as you can see. And I'm using a watercolor sketchbook from the brand Etchr. And I'm gonna try to link the products down below if possible. I can't always find them, but yeah. You can see that I sketched out a landscape, which is not completely basic, but it's also not very layered. It's more on the simple side, I would say. But you can, of course, as always, make it even more simple if you want to, or add more details if that's what you prefer. Really depends on what you're going for. And you can see that I've already started coloring it all in. And I'm using a very limited color palette for this. Mostly I was just using my sap green, which is the warm green tone that you can see, and this turquoise color that I added to my specific palette. It was not already in there. There was this ochre tone that I never used, so I swapped it with this turquoise color that I really love. And I'm also gonna use the pinkish red tone. It's a really cool red tone, so if you dilute it a lot with water, it kind of looks like a pink tone. And then I'm also gonna use a yellow. And that's basically it. That's all of the colors that I used for this, and I kind of mixed them in various ways. I also kind of used a little bit of my ultramarine blue, so I was actually lying. That's another color that I used, but I believe then that's about it. And I just mixed all of these colors to get various shades of different green tones, as you can see with the tree here. And with this piece, I also wanted to play around with the wet on wet technique a lot, which basically means that you don't let everything fully dry. You kind of let it bleed into each other a little bit. You can see that with the bushes and with the gradients that I created. I wanted generally the upper part of the bushes and the greenery to be a little bit lighter and warmer, and then the lower parts to be a darker and cooler color, so that we kind of have a little bit of a gradient going on, and we kind of have this part where maybe the light is hitting the bushes and then the shadow part that's more beneath it, if that makes sense. And I also did that with this hill where I made it a lot darker where it is touching the other bush in the foreground. And that way I also managed to separate all of these shapes from each other, so they kind of stand out in front of each other, even though they are basically the same color. All of this is a pile of green with a little bit of pink and purple mixed into it, which you're gonna see later. But it's mostly just a lot of green, but you can still make out where one of the shapes ends and the other one begins. So this is kind of a tactic that I like to use. If this tutorial is a little bit too fast for you, I recommend checking out my courses, which are a lot slower and go a lot more into detail. I have a very packed full and detailed course about gouache. I have a specific landscape tutorial that's much slower. And I also have a course about how to fill a sketchbook. And I am currently working on another landscape course that's not exclusive to gouache. So stay tuned for that and check out my courses. The link is in the description box below. You can see that I'm now introducing the pink that I was talking about. So this is basically like a quinacridone red. I don't know which color exactly is in this set, but it is a very pink red tone, so it is perfect for just adding a few complementary color touches in there that are not completely red. Personally, I don't like to mix red and green because it gives me Christmas vibes and it's kind of a harsh contrast in my opinion. So I really like mixing green and pink tones and also go a little bit more into the purple. So it's not as much of a contrast, but it's still the colors make each other pop. So we have those little details. You can see that these are mushrooms that I'm coloring in. And I have this gradient on the mushrooms as well, with the yellow more on the top and then the pink more on the bottom. And then the stems of the trees I decided to do with purple because I didn't want to introduce another color. I didn't want to use any brown for this piece, and I also didn't want to mix any brown. I just wanted it to look a little bit more surreal, and I really like using purple tones and pink tones for things like the branches and the stems of trees, because it kind of gives it exactly this more magical vibe and look to it without it being completely bold. So I really enjoy this combination of the colors, and you can see that the branches, the stem, all of it, it comes in these wavy, spirally lines. And I've done this a few times with my tree paintings, and I really enjoy doing this because that way it looks a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more fun than just if it was only one solid color. So I do this quite sometimes if the tree is more of a main focal point and I want it to look a little bit more interesting. And since this piece is more on the simpler side and not so much is going on the picture itself, I wanted to add these subtle details that just give it a little bit more life. And I honestly really love how the green tones work together, especially I usually just use the sap green and the turquoise color, and then I make gradients and make them blend into each other. So we have all of the in-between green shades too. And then sometimes I also use a yellow tone in the more warmer areas of the green. And this is something that I have done repeatedly in my landscapes, and I keep on coming back to this because it is really fun and enjoyable. And you can see that I'm now using more of an ultramarine blue, like a really, really dark blue here. Maybe I also mixed in a little bit of the red to make it even more darker and purple. And then I went in with my turquoise colors. So again, I'm creating this kind of gradient here behind the mushrooms. I had to be a bit more careful because I'm painting around the mushrooms, so I couldn't just slap on the gradient and be done with it since we're using watercolors here. I'm really used to gouache at this point because I've used it so much. So painting around subjects, I mean, I do that quite a lot with gouache too, but with gouache you can get away with forgetting about things and then adding them in later on because it is opaque. With watercolors, you have to think these things through. But then again, I find that my watercolor paintings are so much quicker than my gouache ones are. So if I'm more starved for time, or if I want a quicker result because I can feel myself getting impatient with my art, then that's when I might be more drawn to watercolors, because you can get a really beautiful result, I believe, more quickly, at least in the way that I work. It is more quick because I don't get lost in the perfectionism as much as I do with gouache, because with gouache I really want to add more and more and more details because I can, because it really doesn't matter if you're going dark to light or light to dark, you can go either way. But with watercolors, there's only so much you can do unless you're kind of using other things like masking fluid or you're adding gouache or something to the mix. unless you're doing that, you're kind of limited a little bit and have to paint around your subjects and can only add so much detail until your page is completely filled and gets darker and darker. So it is kind of a little bit of a limitation that comes to my advantage in certain scenarios. So in case you've never thought about this before and this sounds like some kind of thing that would help you with your art or your mindset shift, I really don't know. Maybe this is helpful to you. You can see that I'm basically just coloring in what I have sketched. And this, I would say, is one of the most simplest landscapes that I tend to do, this type of landscape. But I believe it still looks quite cool because we have all of these gradients and color variations, and it doesn't look completely flat or boring because there's still a little bit going on in the depth and in the shadows, even though it's more on the simple side, which is really fun to me. I like to play around with this and think about how much can I simplify something and it still looks kind of decent and not completely boring. I believe that sometimes this more simple art can be even harder than the more detailed art because you can always add more details and slap on more and more, but simplifying something down and making it still look good, I think is really an art form in itself. So if you find that you're not completely happy with your piece, I kind of tend to then go ahead and add more details. And sometimes that makes it look a little bit better. Sometimes it doesn't, but then it's a lost case anyways, and it really doesn't matter. But here I was pretty happy with how it was all coming out and coming together. And honestly, this is still just a painting in my sketchbook, so I'm trying not to be a harsh critic here. This is just for playing around and having fun, and I hope you're doing the same and just enjoying painting things like this and taking this as an inspiration rather than something that you have to follow along to a T. Sometimes people get mad when I don't know exactly what type of colors I'm using, like the pigments and everything. But honestly, you don't have to paint the exact same thing as me to get a good result or to have fun with the piece. So I always encourage everybody to just take some inspiration from it. If you want to, you can try to replicate it as much as you can, but you could also just go ahead and use completely different colors, change it up in the way that you want to. I want you to have the courage to be creative in your own way and turn it into your own little piece in whatever form you would enjoy. And I hope that you can do this in a way that is fun and not completely frustrating, where you feel like you have to make every stroke perfect, because that's really not what we're going for here. Especially with watercolors, I find that they're really fun to play around, let the paint flow and do its thing. And sometimes it just doesn't do exactly what you want, but that's kind of part of the game. That's kind of why we're here. We're letting the paint flow, and you can control it to a certain point, but it sometimes just does what it wants. And I feel like that's the beauty of it. And really it is about playing around with how much water you're using and how much you let every single layer dry in between. So if your other layers are completely dry when you paint something next to them, then the colors are gonna be solid next to each other. But if one shape is still a little bit wet and you're painting very closely to it and you're touching the paint and the part where it's still wet, then it's probably gonna bleed into each other. And you might want that or you might not want that. And depending on whether this is the outcome that you want, you really have to consider how dry everything is. Just wait a little bit in between. Use a heating tool or a hair dryer if you're impatient, so that everything is dry that you want to be dry. And yeah, I really have fun playing around with this because I find this really relaxing because the paint does a lot of the job for you if you let it. So I really enjoy especially the parts of the paintings where you can see that the colors blend into each other a little bit. With the tree, for example, you can see that some of the turquoise blend into the more green, and it really doesn't bother me because that's the look that I'm going for, and that's what I find so fun about watercolors. I really hope that this helps some of you, because I know that sometimes we can get really focused in on trying to get a specific result, and I totally get that. Don't beat yourself up for trying to make it look good. That's totally understandable and valid. But also, if you notice that you're being harsh on yourself, then remind yourself why you're doing it in the first place, which is probably to have a good time, because otherwise why would you create something? And I hope that this video served as a little bit of a reminder and that you enjoy this little landscape painting. You can see that I'm now just going over certain areas again and just adding in the finishing lines. And I also went over this pathway again with a little bit more of a yellow tone, because I wanted it to be a little bit more tinted and read a little bit more as something that would probably be brown, but isn't completely brown. And I was kind of glazing over the paint, so that means I did a thin layer on top of the one that was already there to achieve the result that I wanted. So this is the finished result. If you want to see more ideas on what you can paint with watercolors, then check out this video next.